Well, why don't we start with that journey, the journey of being a scientist who starts companies. Intervin was not your first, and it's not your last either. This is part of a pattern. I'd love to hear the origins of that. How did you become a scientist who was not content to stick with your academic accomplishments, but wanted to translate that into companies?
Well, I think I first learned about the process of translating science from the laboratory into a company when I was a graduate student. And that was at UC Berkeley in the chemistry department back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I worked for a young professor who had aspirations of starting companies, and he would talk about that. Yeah. And as a graduate student, I was focused entirely on my thesis project. But, I saw him filing invention disclosures and trying to patent some of the work that we did. And I was a co-inventor on at least one patent from my Ph.D. thesis work. So I had a very superficial view of the process all the way back in my early 20s, really. And then I got a real flavor for what that feels like when I was a young assistant professor. And my former postdoc advisor from UCSF wanted to start a company with me as a co-founder. So that was my very first co-founded company. And that was around the year, I'm going to say 1999 or 2000.
I was still fairly pioneering for bringing science out of the academic setting. There was, depending on what university you were in, not necessarily a lot of support for that. Did you find that there was resistance or misunderstanding among your either fellow graduate students or fellow professors?
Yes. I'm thinking back to those days, and fortunately, I think by the 1990s, the concept of the academic entrepreneur was fairly well established and appreciated in the Bay Area.
Right.
So, at Berkeley, at UC San Francisco, at Stanford. But even then, I remember there was a time when the chancellor of UCSF was rather negative on the idea that faculty would moonlight as entrepreneurs. And there definitely was a camp of faculty that looked down on that as a distraction from the purity of academic science. Yes. That has changed entirely.
Yes. Although it, unevenly, to your point. Yeah. When I was getting my PhD in genetics in the 90s at Yale, there were a few outliers who were starting to make companies, but it was definitely not talked about, mentored. When I said I was graduating and going into industry, even my most understanding colleague, after hearing why I wanted to do it, eventually said, I get it. I can see why you'd want to do something less than science.
Oh, no.
So,
okay.
So you persevered, though. You thought that was important to do. You had some early mentorship around it being possible. What motivated you to do that, to say yes to your co-founder, for example?
Yes. Well, I think just the idea that work that I contributed to in the academic lab could potentially benefit human health and could directly benefit patients who were in need. That was something that really struck an emotional chord with me. And at the time, and you'll remember this being someone who was, in their 20s, in the late 80s and 90s, you'll remember that this was in the heyday of the AIDS crisis. Yeah. And here in the Bay Area, I had many friends who had HIV and then progressed to AIDS, and they all died. And so my PhD work actually focused on some things related to HIV. And I remember thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if I could actually do something for the people that I care about? Yeah. And eventually, during my postdoctoral years and then as a professor, I started to understand that the way you take your discoveries into a setting where they actually could help patients was through licensing opportunities and through entrepreneurship.
Well, interesting that you just called out those two options, because that can get overlooked. So you do have the option to do your science, you patent it, and you maybe rely on the university to run a licensing campaign, and a large pharma company might pick it up and commercialize it. That certainly is less work than taking time away from your academic work to found a company, co-found a company, recruit people to that, raise money. So how do you think about the why to go the entrepreneurship route?
It's interesting that you call that out because I really never had the option to take the licensing route where you hand off your discovery to usually a big pharmaceutical company that can then prosecute. Probably for the reason that the kind of research that I've done has been in areas of biology which were not in the mainstream.
Right.
And big pharmaceutical companies that are looking for academic licensing opportunities are usually looking for technologies they recognize, right? So things that are a little more in the mainstream. By contrast, if you work in areas that are, kind of way out in front of the mainstream or, in an area that's not as widely appreciated, the chances that a third party will just come in off the street and license that is very low. And so really, in my experience, the only channel to get those kinds of discoveries to patients who need them is to start a company yourself and try to educate, investors and potential pharma partners about the nature of the science and the opportunity.